You'll believe a man can review. Let's talk about Donner Superman.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are back, the Eye of the Storm podcast. So, today it's Have You Seen? Daniel, may you please let the people know what we're going to be discussing or debating today?
So this is Have You Seen, in which we talk about a movie that some of us know well and others have just seen for the first time. This week we are talking about 1978's Superman, directed by Richard Donner, which was probably the first proper superhero movie that was ever put on screen. And it was the first Superman movie that would define the character for decades to come. And we decided to talk about this movie because the new Superman movie is coming out next week. So we thought we'd go back to more or less the beginning, at least as far as movies are concerned, and see what the character was like back then and how that compares with what the character is like today. So I've seen the movie a couple of times, and I think the two of you have seen it for the first time, right?
Yep.
So quickly to recap, so the story is essentially a very archetypical Superman story. In the beginning, we see Jor-El before the Council of Krypton trying to prevent the destruction of Krypton. He gets turned down. He sends his infant son to Earth to survive the cataclysm. He is found by Ma and Pa Kent in rural Kansas, grows up in Smallville. After Pa Kent dies from a heart attack, he goes on a journey to discover himself and finds the Fortress of Solitude in the Arctic, where he learns about his heritage, and then decides to become Superman. And then in the second half of the movie, he goes to Metropolis to become a reporter for the Daily Planet, where he encounters Lex Luthor, who is trying to pull off a real estate scam that involves nuking the San Andreas fault line to sink California into the sea in order to increase the value of real estate that he has bought up for cheap. That is essentially the plot of Superman. What did you guys think of the movie?
So, I'll start off by saying I don't think this film is for me. However, there were good moments. I just had like 3 issues with it. Firstly was the pacing, second was the villain, and third was kind of like the uneven tone. But before I get into that, like I said, I actually did enjoy moments of the film. I kind of liked, I wouldn't say it was continuous internal conflict which was shown throughout the film, but it was an internal conflict that you would see moments of, like, Superman kind of like saying secret. And I think he was kind of like fighting that because he was put in situations like, for example, in the beginning when you see him in high school, where obviously he's being not bullies, but I'll say people that are kind of like, see him as the nerdy type, and then he kind of like wants to show off and show out, especially in front of Lana, the girl that you clearly see that he can have a crush on. And then he had that conversation with his dad, or 2 dads, in terms of like the importance of the secrecy as well as being humble. And then there was another moment where he's saving people, and then he even had a conversation with his dad Jor-El about like afterwards when he kind of like indulged in saving more people and kind of like showing out, and actually when he pretty much when he no longer became a secret, right? You could see, I actually liked that sequence where you could see where he's slowly indulging in the fame of it all and the feeling of it all, of the good feeling of saving people and actually like being known for saving people, you know what I'm saying, rather doing it in secret. So I liked those sequences, and I like that topic being shown. However, I just think the pacing issues, it was very slow at times, so it was kind of hard to stay engaged, because I think there was certain scenes which were kind of like prolonged, especially like the scene with him and Lois when he's flying around with her, when she's having the interview with him, that was kind of long. And then there was obviously his conversation with Lex when pretty much Lex tells him about the bombs, but prior to that they're having like a very long conversation. So when him and Lex meet for the first time, I thought that's pretty long. I think that could have been a bit shorter. So there was other moments as well, and also like the uneven tone. Sometimes it felt like a sci-fi, which it was, but then it also felt like a comedy. I think I've been so accustomed to Zack Snyder's Superman, because I think like Zack Snyder's Superman's the only Superman that I'm familiar with. I have seen other Supermans. I think I have. The one on ITV, it was a series. And Smallville, I've seen that too. So I'm accustomed to the serious type of Clark Kent. You can tell he's not human. He's human, but you can tell like he's a bit of an odd one. Like he's not human. So he's from the earth, like he's down to earth, but he's not really from the earth, if that makes sense. I think that's what like the Zack Snyders and the Smallville Supermans kind of give. Whereas this one, it was a bit more too down to earth for me. It was a bit too jolly, like I said, which is cool, but it felt like I was watching 2 movies. Like, you said Batman back in the day was originally a comedy. That's what it felt like. If for one half felt like a Superman was like a comedy in a way, but another half felt like, oh, okay, this is pretty serious. So I think the tones had me a bit in and out with the film. But overall, I just say overall it wasn't for me. However, I do appreciate what I saw. I definitely is like for its time and the effects I was seeing. I was like, okay, I'm pretty sure if I was there back in the day, that would have been cool. And the performances were cool as well. Like I like Lois's performances. I did like Clark's performances too. Overall, I definitely do appreciate the film for what it's done for the superhero genre. However, I just don't think that this film was for me.
Hervey, what about you?
I think I'm similar-ish to what Jonathan said about the movie, where I don't think I completely love the movie, but I do appreciate what it was for its time and what it did for comic book movies, and how it really brought a lot of the comic booky stuff to screen. So mainly things like the Fortress of Solitude and when that's being formed, and when you seeing that coming together was pretty cool. And of course, for its time, him flying and zipping around the place, I thought was quite well done, actually, better than I thought it would look in this movie. I did have issue with the origin story. I understand why it needed to be there, and I understand its purpose, because obviously this is the first time you're seeing this type of movie on screen, and you have to adapt the material, and you're putting things in there that people are familiar with and people want to see. But I don't know, I just was not engaged with the whole origin story up until the point where he goes to the Daily Planet and starts to interact with Lois Lane and starts to transform into Superman. Everything before that, I was like, it felt like it dragged. It felt like it was just all too long and it wasn't really that interesting. And I think there's a bias in that as well, because I have seen other Superman movies like Man of Steel, I have seen Smallville, so I've experienced the origin story already. So it was a bit like, okay, we're doing this again. So I wasn't as engaged, admittedly. But again, if it was for the first time seeing this and I hadn't seen any other Superman movie, maybe it would have got me a little bit more than it did at that point. But everything after that, I actually quite enjoyed. I thought it was pretty alright for the most part. Like I said, the flying scenes and stuff like that was pretty cool. His relationship with Lois, I actually quite liked a lot. The way that they differentiated between Clark Kent and Superman was really well done as well. You can kind of see that they were two separate characters. And for Chris Reeve in this as well, you can kind of see him. Like he really fits being Superman in this movie. He just has the look and he has the gravitas and the personality to be Superman. So I think that was a really good fit in terms of the casting wise. Lex and his henchmen, I don't think I really cared for in this movie. I think they were a bit too camp in this movie. The plot point was, whatever it was alright. It wasn't anything out of this world. The other part I actually did enjoy was the whole montage of him saving people, because I know that's meant to be his big thing, is the good one or the goody two shoes.
Literally saving a kitten out of a tree.
Yeah, exactly. And actually seeing him do that and seeing him just be heroic and fly about and just try to help as many people as he could. I thought it was refreshing to see, especially coming off of Man of Steel, where you didn't get too much of that. And again, I'm not the biggest comic book person, but if it's meant to be a defining trait of his character, then it was good to see. And it was good to just mentally compare his portrayal compared to what we got in Man of Steel, and just the difference in how the movie views Superman and what he's meant to represent and what he's meant to be about.
One thing I want to quickly add, sorry, I honestly it's kind of like a good thing, but I'm kind of disappointed because it started off really good, especially with like the introduction of General Zod and kind of like their interaction between obviously Jor-El and General Zod, like that whole scene there, and even like after that, from the collapse of obviously their planet, that whole scene there, I really liked, and I thought that kind of like set off the tone of what I'm gonna receive. But then that's when it kind of shifted to the whole comedy side of things, which is like, it's cool, I get it, but it's like, I was kind of disappointed because I thought the way that it started was really good. And I think, okay, this feels like it's going to be like a good story. Forget kind of like what everything else that's going on in terms of like the, him flying around and, what I'm saying, the superhero stuff. I thought like the story was actually going to be good. I thought it was going to be, what I'm saying? But then that's when it kind of turned into the whole, comedy side of things. I was like, okay, it's looking like it's not going to be for me.
Yeah, I think there's a few good things here that we should talk about, but I find it interesting that the parts we like is so different, because to me, the second half is the part where I go do laundry, and the first half is actually the one where I'm kind of engaged. Everything on Krypton and everything in Smallville, I think is really almost pitch perfect. It just tries very hard to do the definitive version of this basic story that at this point, I think has only been told in comics. I don't know exactly. Like there was some Superman stuff before this. Like there was like a serial in the 50s and so on. I don't know if Superman was on TV before this, but this is like the first time a general movie-going audience saw Superman if they didn't know him from the comics, right? So this is basically an origin story that tries very hard to catch people up and explain this character to people and to kind of hit all the big beats, right? We've got General Zod being sentenced to the Phantom Zone. We've got Jor-El trying to save Krypton. We've got Kal-El being sent to Earth. We've got Krypton exploding. We have Martin Parkent finding him in a field. We have him growing up in Smallville and frustrated as his powers manifest. Parkent dying. Like, we make very clear how big of an influence his parents, and especially his father, was on Clark. These are all very standard beats now. But for an audience in 1978, this was a new story, right? This is the first time they had seen this, unless they were very invested comic fans. But this is a story that we've seen like several times over now, and depending on your tastes, maybe have seen better. So, Hervé, specifically, since you said you didn't like it, what was it like? Is it just that you've seen this before and you've seen it better, or is it actually boring, or what's the deal?
I think for me, it's boring. And it's not just this specific movie. I feel like just origin stories as a whole, I'm kind of over. And I feel like I've seen enough of them, whether it's Spider-Man, Batman, Superman, etc. I think it's more the familiarity with it, that I already know what's going to happen, how it's going to play out, is that I'm not immediately engaged. I'm like, okay, I kind of already know this. I don't really have to pay too much attention to it because it's going to play out how it's already played out in other things that I have seen. So I just wasn't as engaged with it. And at the same time, I don't think it was, for me anyways, executed all that well. It kind of felt quite camp, and for me, actually badly acted, to be honest. It just felt, I don't want to say dull, but I think that's the only word that's coming to me. It just kind of felt dull. I didn't like the whole design of the council. I didn't like General Zod's portrayal, and especially when they got sent to the Phantom Zone, or whatever it's called, and they were in that little disc thing and they were all like wailing and stuff like that. It just didn't fit for me. It actually kind of made me not want to see Zod in any of the movies, just because of how he was portrayed, because he's meant to be like quite like, well, I don't know the comics that well, but to my mind, I refer to Man of Steel, and he's meant to be, quite hardcore, quite tough, and he just kind of felt a bit weak and a bit like he was like wailing and stuff like that, and I was just like, okay, I'm not enjoying that aspect of it. And then when it came to the Smallville stuff, I don't know what it is, but it just didn't connect with me at all.
That's interesting, because to me, it just hits all the notes it's supposed to hit. But if we see that version done today, it's more polished. The acting is a little bit more refined, where here it's very naturalistic. So I can see kind of it not grabbing you. It just, for me, as somebody who knows that story, just seeing it done in such a back to basics way is something that's enjoyable. Another thing about this movie that I think hasn't necessarily aged well is the effects. The tagline of this movie is, "You'll believe a man can fly." Like, one of the missions that the director had for this is to make you believe in the reality of Superman. And the flying effects are a big part of this. But there's also other stuff, like the entire Krypton sequence and all the disasters in the end, right? Like when the dam breaks and the big fault line opens and all of that. And when Superman is chasing the nuclear missile. All of that is, I think, for 1978, fairly ambitious. And this movie had a fairly big budget. So I think when you just pull it off the shelf and just watch it as a movie, it's obviously not that impressive. But I think for the time, it was pretty groundbreaking. So my question here would be, if you watch it for the first time in 2025, does it just not have that effect? Or obviously, it's not going to be all that impressive, right? Because we're used to better things when it comes to effects. But considering that so much emphasis is put on making these effects work, does it still?
I think for me, everything before the final act actually did work for me in terms of the flying. So that was a tagline that I did have in my head, was making you believe a man can fly. I was quite conscious of that whenever I was seeing any of the flying sequences in this movie. And for me, anytime he's like flying through the city, flying to save, Lois when she's hanging out with the helicopter, and kind of just doing his normal Superman stuff throughout the movie, I thought was pretty fine. I thought it was actually, again, looking at it through the lens of 1978 and this being the first time something like this is being done, for me, I was like, okay, it still works for me now, and it probably worked even better for people in 1978 seeing it for the first time. I would agree, though, in the final act, that's when it gets a little bit janky, and I think that's when they're getting a little bit more ambitious, when they're making him chase a rocket and they're making him fly around the world and stuff like that. That's when it gets a little bit janky, and you can kind of see that the effects aren't as great, especially looking at it through a lens of 2025. But still, for its time, it's trying to convey speed, and it's trying to convey him chasing after a missile and showing that he is superhuman and stuff. So for that, I give it a little bit of a pass. I will say as well, the other part that I didn't think was done really well was the running when he was chasing the train, when he was running past the train. At that point, I was a bit concerned about how the effects in the movie were going to be. It just looked a little bit ridiculous, the way that he was running and the way that he was going after the train, and then even how he passed the train. I was a bit like, okay, this is all a bit ridiculous. So I was a little bit concerned at that point, but it definitely did improve after that point.
And it would be another 40 years or more until somebody made super speed really look good. Like, it's really hard to make somebody look good running at that kind of speed, right?
Yeah, and actually, funny enough, I actually think the best depiction of that is in The Eternals, which is a movie that is quite polarizing and not a lot of people do like. But I think the speedster in that movie was probably handled the best that I've seen.
Yeah, I know what scene you're referring to. That was good. That was all over social media as well. That scene was crazy.
I actually think like that running scene is one of the worst effects in terms of the overall movie. Like, there's some later on, like when the dam bursts and he kind of blocks the valley with the rocks to kind of create an impromptu dam in order to save the town. That's clearly a model, right? And then when the big flood comes, like shoots at the camera, like clearly that's not really there, right? But I think in most scenes you can really see the intention, and you can see what they were going for, and you can see this being, if you grade on a curve, it still looks good, it still looks impressive, and the running scene is just kind of just on the low end of that. One I really liked is in the very beginning, where I think he's the water carrier for the football team, right? He's basically cleaning up after them, and then when they leave, he just kicks the ball and just goes to space. And it's just such an understated and small thing that kind of expresses like his frustration and the fact that he could dominate all of them if he wanted to, right? He could be the best and he could be the absolute rock star, and he's chosen not to. We can see he can do it, and he does it in secret. It's very obvious, it's very simple, but I think that is just one that really works and where you don't need much of an effect to convey that idea. And so I think for that reason, it's one of the stronger moments in this. There's also some really janky ones when he saves Lois from the helicopter and he just holds the helicopter to the side and there's no attention paid to like the center of mass and all of that, and it just simply does not look real because he's just holding it like with an outstretched arm as opposed to lifting it up or whatever. Like, there are certain things that are not quite like where you, at least I am kind of pulled out of it. But I think for the most part, if you take the time into consideration, I think it does look pretty good. One other aspect that I think this movie is really known for, and that is kind of the cultural legacy of this movie, especially when it comes to its place in the genre, is just how corny and earnest Superman is in this. And especially Clark Kent even more so than Superman. So how did this come across to you? Was it too much? Is it not your Superman? Or was it just right?
Like, I liked the earnest vibe that he was giving. I didn't think he was corny at all.
He gets a lecture from Lois about how Swell is already out of date by 20 years in the year in the 70s. He is already meant to be corny in that time.
For me personally, I just didn't really feel that he was that corny. I thought mainly was Lex and the people that was around Lex that was corny. That was my main issue. I thought that was something which didn't bother me. I was like, okay, that's cool. I get it, because I don't know which series it was, but I used to watch a lot back in the day, the Superman series on ITV, right? And even though they were clearly like, they had some similarities, but they were clearly different. However, that was a part of like just him being kind of like humble, and he's kind of shy, and that characteristic to him was something which I liked about him, because deep down, if you really want to, you could be an asshole. You could be like that, in Smallville, the Red Ring, that Red Ring that turned him into like the arrogant guy. He could be that if he wanted to, but question, was that actually his personality, like the whole, shy guy, or was that all an act?
Well, that's an interesting question, right? So my view is that Superman is his real him, and you'll notice that when he talks to his parents, he talks as if he's Superman. And then Clark Kent is a persona. And I think one of the things that this movie really does right is how he switches between the two personas, where he slouches as Clark Kent. It's not just like people always make like the meme is that if you just put on some glasses, nobody will recognize you, right? And how do people not know that Clark Kent and Superman are not the same person? But it's not just the glasses. It's the posture, it's the way he talks. He's much more timid. His tone of voice changes. It's much deeper and more assertive as Superman, and it's kind of nerdy and insecure and nervous as Clark Kent. His entire mannerisms are completely different. There's like the scene after he does the interview as Superman, he shows up as Clark Kent at Lois's apartment to take her out to dinner, right? Within about 30 seconds, we see him go from one to the other. And then while she goes and changes, he switches to his Superman posture for a second because he's thinking about telling her. And then he decides against it and he slouches back into the Clark Kent persona, which I think is one of the really cool little character moments in this. Throughout the movie, there are a bunch of little moments where we kind of see an insight into what Clark Kent is like and what Superman is like and what Kal-El is like. And that some of these are acts to various degrees. And that is like one of those moments where we can see the degree to which he is acting when he is around other people. And when he pretends to be human, he's putting on an act in various different ways, right? And Superman is kind of his true self, I think, is fair to say.
One thing, actually, let me take back Shy, because when he was Clark, he still seemed affirmative and confident, because some of the things that he was doing, I wouldn't really associate with a shy guy. I think the best way to describe Clark when he's Clark is that he's awkward. That's the best word to use. Because, like, for example, him asking out Lois, that's not something really, like, asking out Lois to dinner. I don't think that's something which a shy guy wouldn't do or a nervous guy would do. Or, for example, him, what's the name, Jimmy, when Jimmy, I think, called him another name. I think he just called him Clark. And then he said, my name's Clark Kent. So that's something which shows, you know what I'm saying, like, he's showing a bit of his Superman side, you know what I'm saying? So I don't think he was shy. I take that back. I don't think he was shy or nervous. I just think he was awkward and clumsy a bit. I think that's the best way to describe Clark in this film.
He certainly plays shy and awkward and nervous and all of that, but underneath he's always guiding events to where he wants them to be, right? He just needs to make it look like somebody else's idea. What else stood out to you? Man of Steel has been kind of like the Snyder version has been the dominant version of this for the last 10 years. And before that, we have things like the animated series. And like you mentioned, like what you saw was probably The Adventures of Lois and Clark, which was the 90s TV show, which is still different. Any other observations about how the character works in this?
I'll just say one quickly. One thing that I will say that this Superman did better than any other Superman I've seen is, which we've pretty much kind of like touched upon, was that there was two Supermans. As in, like, there was a Superman and there was Clark Kent. So there was a difference in personality and character. Whereas I feel like the other Superman, well, I think I can only refer to the Man of Steel and obviously Justice League, but that's still kind of like that's in the same universe. But like in the Man of Steel, Superman and Clark Kent felt like the same person in terms of like personality and character. Whereas this one, there was a clear difference, you know what I'm saying, in the two characters, which was done really well, which I enjoyed, actually. I enjoyed that, you know, yeah, Superman was different. I think that's something which I enjoyed in the series as well. So from what I could remember. So yeah, that's a highlight for me.
One difference I actually liked, and what I actually like about the upcoming Superman movie as well, is his build and his physique. Because again, with the Man of Steel, he's completely like, you know, jacked, he's ripped, he's got the typical Superman body where he's got all the muscles, etc. Whereas in this movie, he doesn't really have that. He just kind of, again, looks like a normal person. He looks like just any other person, but he has all the powers, he has all the strength within him. And I just felt like it fit a little bit better, especially when you're kind of flipping back and forth between Superman and Clark Kent, and it makes the believability again of him as Clark Kent. There's no possible way that he could be Superman, because one, his personality, his awkwardness, his clumsiness, but again, because Superman isn't, you know, this super like jack person or whatever, he's just like a normal person, is that you can quite easily look past this person. Whereas in like something like, and I was just sitting here thinking about it, in Man of Steel, where you got Henry Cavill and he's got great physique, great body, but it's like, okay, how do you portray shy, awkward, and bumbly, etc. when you're sort of built like that? You're naturally going to get attention. You know, it's a lot harder to look past you when you're in a room, just because of the way you're built and the sort of size you are, etc. So that's one aspect I actually did like about this movie. And again, one thing I do like about the upcoming Superman movie is that he just, especially from what we've seen so far, is he just looks regular, but in a Superman suit.
Quick thing, I agree with what you're saying, but at the same time, it's a bit of an issue, because it's like, if in this Superman he's not skinny, but let's say he just doesn't look like Superman, that kind of contradicts the character, as in like what the character is known for, because it's like Superman is supposed to be Superman, the most elite of the elite, especially when it comes to it should be associated with his physique as well. So if this one, he's looking a bit like not fragile, but he's not looking as super as he's supposed to be. Does that really make him? Does that make him Superman? Like, is that something which would be like, okay, this he shouldn't be looking at. He shouldn't be looking like this. This is the wrong image for Superman, if that makes sense.
I think Christopher Reeve is still a very athletic guy in this. It's just all the posture and the body language and the mannerisms that just distract from it. Like simply by slouching, he just looks less imposing. Like he shrinks by like half a head when he does it, right? He does simply does not look as strong. He does not look as muscular as Superman. But when he is Superman, he stands upright and he has the broad shoulders and like all of that is really maximized. And then as Clark Kent, it's really minimized. And it's been, I don't know, many years, probably almost a decade since I actually watched Man of Steel. I don't know how much of a difference there is between Clark and Superman. I don't think it's played up at all, right?
Yeah, when you say difference, you mean in terms of like the characters, as in
like the mannerisms. Like I don't think Henry Cavill put nearly as much effort into or emphasis on looking different as Clark.
Yeah, I agree. That was literally my point I made before. Like it felt like watching the same person. It felt like watching Superman. So yeah, I get what you're saying. I agree.
And like for me, again, it's not about him not being athletic as well, but it's more like the bulkiness of like Henry Cavill, where because he's so huge, it makes it a little bit more difficult to have that differentiation. Whereas like again with Christopher Reeve, he's still athletic, but because he's a little bit more leaner, it's easier to kind of disguise it and hide it, essentially.
How about Lois? What did we think of Lois on this?
I liked Lois. She wasn't too much. I don't know what Lois I was expecting to get, but she wasn't like over the top. I think she was giving me strong independent woman vibes, and that was the right kind of like right move for her character. You can kind of tell she was meant for Superman because she just like I said she I don't know, she just had that characteristic about her that I'd understand why someone like Clark, no, not even Clark, someone like Superman, because Clark, women like that, you should kind of like run away from. Not run away from, but you'd expect them to run away from because they're the type that you could tell that you wouldn't be able to. You could tell that she would be not bullying him, but she would be like the man in the relationship, right? So, which was interesting to kind of see someone like Clark go for her when he's a bit like, like I think he was just a bit awkward. So, but yeah, but others would say he's a bit timid and shy and stuff. So yeah, but it was good because you know that deep down he's Superman. So the Superman in him makes sense for him to go for a woman like Lois. You know what I'm saying? So that's I liked that. So I think in terms of Lois, her character, I think she did what she was supposed to do. Whenever she came on the screen, I think that's when I was kind of like not the most engaged, but I was engaged. So her character, yeah, she was good. She was good.
I kind of like her in this. Like my problem with Lois is that in very few of the versions that I've seen, and there've been a few, has she really been satisfying. Like in my mind, Lois Lane should be kind of the intrepid reporter, somebody without powers existing in a world full of superheroes, just doing her job, trying to get to the bottom of the story. And I was like 3 years ago, I said, surely there must be a comic series about her, right? Where she goes on some investigation without Superman, and how does somebody just through intellect and stubbornness get to the truth in a world full of supervillains? And apparently there has never been a Lois Lane comic book series. And I don't know, maybe that's out of date now. It's been a few years since I checked. Maybe I just didn't find it. But I think that character is really underserved in almost every incarnation, where she's kind of relegated to somebody that Superman has to save. And I'm not against the damsel in distress archetype. Like, I think there's a place for it. It's just a problem with if every character is like this. Like, she doesn't do a whole lot in this, right? And obviously she'll have to be saved a couple of times in this movie because we're doing the basic version of this and the archetypical version. But she's also mostly a source of slapstick, right? Where she just can't spell for some reason, and like there's just a lot of stuff like this. So I don't think she's in any way the worst version. Like the Man of Steel version just gave her nothing to do at all, where she was just in the background and there to motivate Superman. But just every time I watch a version of Superman, I'm pretty much frustrated about how can you not do something interesting with this character? And we'll see in the new Superman movie. I think the only thing she does in the trailer is fly a spaceship, which is like, how does a reporter know how to fly a spaceship? Can she just do some investigating and have that be important to the plot? I don't know. For some reason, all of these movies kind of struggle with that concept. And I think she's kind of similar here, where there's just like she does not get to do all that much. For me, the big problem in the movie is Lex. Any thoughts on Lex?
I think he was just, I don't know if you know, but I think it was a mixture of many things. But I think the main thing was he was surrounded around jokers, and it was like you could tell that he was a bit serious, which was cool, but he was kind of like funny serious. And if it was just him by himself, not even him by himself, it was him with that character, that type of character around serious people, then maybe it might have been okay. But I think it was just too. This Lex Luthor was just, I don't know, man. It was just infuriating to watch. I didn't like this Lex at all.
For me, one, it took a little bit too long for me to understand what his deal was and what he really wanted in this movie. And I know he's meant to be not infatuated, but he's meant to be obsessed with Superman, and he's meant to be, obsessed with taking him down. But I didn't quite get what his deal was for a lot of this movie. The whole him being surrounded by the girl and the guy was like you said, it was just comedy. It wasn't anything really to take serious. And I think pairing him with those two just really brought down his character, because it just made everything that he was doing completely unserious, and you just never really took his character that seriously at all in this movie. And then it does some like early comic booky stuff where you have him just basically explaining his plan to Superman. Superman can go and stop what he did, which was pretty bad. It was terrible to watch. And yeah, I felt like there was like a few leaps as well taken in this movie about how he knew about kryptonite and how he knew that would be a foil to Superman and things like that. I think there was like one too many leaps in there. And again, it's nothing to do with the actor. It's himself. I just think everything that Lex was surrounded by and some of the material that he was given to work with just didn't work for me at all.
Yeah, just to kind of add, I think as well another issue which Heavy kind of touched upon in not understanding what his kind of like motivation was. I think his character just was, as in like it is what it is type of, because I think they even asked him, I don't know, but someone must have asked him. Oh, so the girl asked him something about why are you killing all these innocent people, and he just says because I want to. And I was like, okay, so he's just evil because he's just evil. There wasn't actually a reason to why he was doing it. The reason was he just wants to.
Yeah, and it is greed too, right? So my problem with Lex is, so first of all, I like Lex a lot, like as a character. This whole idea of the genius who believes he deserves to rule the world, right? And who has a chip on his shoulder about the champion of humanity not being a human, which is kind of adjacent to the idea that he believes he should be the champion of humanity, or he should be at least recognized and celebrated as such. Like that whole thing is something that's really interesting. And in good versions of Lex Luthor, he is an adversary to Superman, not because of how powerful it is, but because of how smart he is. And because Superman is not the smartest, right? So it is actually relatively easy to trick Superman or to fool Superman. And there are some versions of this character that really lead into that. I think my favorite version of this is from the animated series, where this happens frequently. And most versions, especially the movie versions, are just not that. Like, and this is exacerbated by the fact that pretty much every version of Superman has to go to Lex first. Like, I honestly, like when the new Superman movie was announced, one of the things that made me that deflated my enthusiasm for it is to see that Lex was going to be the villain again, because like we've seen this so many times and it's just never all that good. The Man of Steel, the Jesse Eisenberg version is not that great. This version is not that great. He just never quite realizes his potential. And I think the way this fits into this movie is that they wanted to tell the story of Superman, which is the Krypton part, and it's the Smallville part, and it's the part in the Fortress of Solitude. But then you need to have an extra plot in the movie. Like, I think on paper you could have made a movie that just ends with him reaching the Fortress of Solitude and beginning to learn about his heritage. If the movie is about who is Clark Kent and who is, like, is he Clark Kent, is he Kal-El, is he Superman, what's the difference between those three, is there a difference? You could have made a movie about that. But they decided to not do it. They decided to make that half of the movie, and the other half is him being Superman in Metropolis, and then he needs a villain to fight. And in 1978, it had you can't put Brainiac or something, or a character like this on screen, right? You just can't do it. So you have to do something smaller, which means Lex, right? but then they failed to give him an interesting scheme, and they just came up with this nonsense scheme about sinking California into the sea to boost real estate values, which makes him a whole bunch of money. But then he's also like you said, he's surrounded by these idiots that just make him even worse. And that's just all this weird slapstick and jokes kind of sprinkled into the movie, and they're mostly centered on Lex. And it's like every time I watch this movie, I'm having a really good time as he's kind of figuring out his identity and all of that. And then, oh no, now we have to endure Lex for an hour, and it's really a really strange issue for the movie, because surely you could have come up with something like have him run for president, have him run for mayor, have him just be an industrialist that that everybody believes is this great philanthropist who is making the city better, but Superman sees through him, or what, it's not difficult to come up with a story that could have been made in 1978. I think that still would have been much better than whatever this clown show is.
What he feels like, and I know, Daniel, you have a little bit more experience with movies from that time, but he just feels like a generic villain that you would get in that time, where he's a little bit more mustache twirling, he's a little bit more, like you said, like slapstick, and just a little bit less serious, less guided in his like motivation, and is essentially just in the movie for the sake of needing to have a villain, as opposed to really trying to have a good story, or really have, I don't know, it just felt like, okay, this is the type of villain that you'd probably typically see in those movies set around that time.
I don't think it's a movie thing. I think it's a superhero thing, where this sounds like a plot from the comics from the 60s or something. And I've not read enough of them. I've read a few here and there, and a lot of them tend to have quite lame villain motivations and plots. But there's like this whole real estate scam and whatever that seems like something out of the 60s. And it could well be that this is based on some comic book arc from, at that point, 10, 15 years ago, and they just pulled something out of the archives, like as an inspiration for the story. And they said, well, what, like, we just do something. Like, and, on paper, this is like a fairly comic booky thing, right? Like this whole thing about nuking the San Andreas Fault and all of that, like, that is something I'm sure has been done in the comics a bunch of times. So it's not like this is out of character or this is not true to the genre or something. I just think it's lame. I think that's kind of what it boils down to. I think this is totally authentic to the character and totally authentic. Like Lex in the early decades, as far as I know, was basically like this mad scientist who was angry at Superman for some reason. I think in the early versions, Superman is the reason he's bald. And then like Lex just wants to take revenge, and he comes up with these harebrained science schemes to kind of go after Superman. And it kind of feels like it seems to like this plot seems to come out of this area a little bit. And I'm speculating because I don't know the early comics that like well enough to know where exactly this came from, or maybe they just made it up out of whole cloth. But I don't think this is just what movies were like. Like 1978, like this is like when some really grungy crime dramas were being made, and I think the new wave, something like that. There was like this resurgence in the early 70s with all these auteur directors. So it's not like movies were just like this. I think this is a comic book thing, and I honestly think they wanted to do Superman's origin, but then needed to fill more movie, and so they did something. It's kind of my guess. What else is there to say about Superman? How do we feel about turning back time? So Lois dies in the avalanche, right? She dies in her car from a rock slide, and Superman gets there too late, and he goes into space and flies counterclockwise around the Earth in order to reverse its spin, which turns back time. And then he flies forward again to make time go again, and this time he saves Lois. But what do we think about that?
I mean, it doesn't completely make sense, and I don't think it's really explained all that well in the movie. But I think I give it a pass just because I've seen it done in The Flash.
That's what I was gonna say.
Yeah, I've seen it done in The Flash. So, and I can't remember if there was even an explanation for why it worked in The Flash there as well. But I was just like,
yeah, there was. So I don't fully know the explanation, but I do know it was even in like Zack Snyder's cut of Justice League. I think there was like a little explanation as well, but pretty much the faster you go, sign about if you go fast enough, you can reverse time or go back in time. And I think that's technically true. Like, I think that's what even scientists say now about you can manipulate time with speed. I'm not sure. I don't know if I just made that up, but I think.
So this is relativity, where basically as you get close to the speed of light, time and space kind of stretch. And if you go faster than the speed of light, which is not really possible, but if you did, you could potentially go back in time. And this is where this comes from. So Flash kind of has this idea that if he runs faster than the speed of light, he can time travel. This is where this comes from. But here he physically turns back the globe.
But the reason why I definitely gave this an extra pass, why I kind of liked it, because I remember the scene in Flash. I don't know if it was a Flash, but it was the scene between Flash and Superman when they had a race. And the way Superman beat Flash, I was like, damn, Superman is fast. So that's how I was like, if Flash can turn back time, then what we're seeing now in Superman 1978 is very likely. So I was like, all right, cool. I give that extra pass, and I kind of liked it in a way, but I was like, and it kind of did set up for, obviously, Jor-El was talking about how he shouldn't intervene, obviously, with like human history and stuff. So I was like, okay, this has major consequences. And also, like, you know, that is that, and also with General Zod, I'm sure he's gonna be introduced as well. So when that happened, I said, oh, okay, what he's doing now is all great because he saved Lois. However, you can tell it's setting up for something bad in the second movie, especially we know with the existence of General Zod. So I wonder how what he did will kind of like will what implications it has basically.
Yeah, it's definitely foreshadowed. I think there's at least twice where we hear the voiceover of Jor-El warning about it or telling him not to do this. And I think it's still terrible writing. So, like, honestly, like, this is the worst way to finish the story. One of the reasons is why, like, it raises the question of why doesn't he do this every time? Like, he doesn't need special knowledge, he doesn't need special training, he doesn't need special equipment, he can just do it because of how fast he is. So every time there's a problem, a Kryptonian should be able to just turn back time. And it just breaks stories. Like, unless you build your story around it, it just breaks it.
Yeah, but that's breaking a law, though. Technically, to him, that's like breaking a law. It's like we can break laws whenever we want to, but we're not going to do it because it's breaking a law. So for him, Jor-El telling him not to do something, that's law. But he's like, okay, no, I'm going to have to break the law in this situation because it's the woman that I love just died. So,
but everybody who could enforce that law is dead. Like, Jor-El is not throwing him into prison.
Yeah, but you could tell already the way you can tell that Clark, he's a respectful young man who listens to his elders. Obviously, with
not this time.
Well, yeah, but that's the whole point. Like, this was under extreme circumstances. You know what I'm saying? Unforeseen circumstances, and that's realistic because you know what I'm saying. My parents are going to tell me to do something, and most times I will. But if it's something in the situation where I'm like, okay, no, I have to actually do it, something that they don't want me to do, then in that situation, I'll have to do it.
I mean, it makes sense. So, like, it makes sense that he would break this rule in this moment, right? Because he cares that much. It's the like, but our writer still decided that this was a possibility and decided to resolve the story in this way, and that is terrible. I've mentioned one reason. The other one is that it just undoes the consequences of his actions. If he can undo all his mistakes, and when he realizes that one of his actions has consequences he doesn't like, he can just undo it. I think that's just terrible. And I think it's also kind of like it's not really all that justified. Like, it simply doesn't make sense. Like, it doesn't come out of nowhere in the sense that Jor-El tells him this is something he can do, but the way he does it makes zero sense. He doesn't turn back in time, he turns back the clock in the entire Earth, right? And that is different, I think. So for that reason, I think this is just the worst possible way they could have ended the story. And I care about character choices, I care about endings, and this kind of is the opposite of all of that. Like, it's just the worst way this could have ended. So I already don't like Lex. I already don't like the plan. And then it ends in just the cheapest cop out ever. And then kind of ties into, like, one of the other problems with Superman is that he tends to get powers kind of at random, where, like, the basic version of it is he's tough, he's fast, he's strong, he can fly. At some point he got his laser eyes, but every once in a while, and if you haven't seen 3 and 4 yet, hold onto your pants. Like, there's some stuff in there where he also gets powers more or less at random because the writer thought it was a cool idea. It's just a terrible way to resolve this. Like, in my view, especially with something like superheroes, you have to set up the powers in the beginning so we know what this character is capable of doing. And then they need to be challenged in a way where we can kind of understand why this character is being challenged. And then we need to see them overcome it through principle or courage or stubbornness or ingenuity or something. where they overcome their limitations to solve this problem that is now in front of them. And that is not what happens here. Ending a superhero, like a Superman story, in this way, I think it's just the cheapest of the cheap. I already don't like the second half of the movie as much. And then it just keeps steadily going downhill from there, which is kind of my biggest problem with the movie, I think. Any other thoughts on Superman? Having seen this for the first time just now, do you kind of see why it has the reputation it has, why it has the place in movie history that it has? Or is this just 50-year-old jank?
I can see the appeal, and I can see how, especially being one of the early comic book movies, it's important in film history for everything that came afterwards. But it doesn't quite hold up. And again, it comes out at a time where I don't think comic books and comic book movies were, or maybe comic books were popular at the time, but maybe the comic book movies weren't the thing that Hollywood were chasing, and the thing that attracted the biggest stars and the best writers and the best directors, etc. So
Marlon Brando was one of the biggest names in this. He was so difficult. Like the production history of this is kind of fascinating, and I don't know all the ins and outs of it. And I could summarize the Wikipedia page, but there's no real point in that. But one of the big things is that in order to gain legitimacy for this movie, they cast Marlon Brando as Jor-El, and they gave him, I think, what was it, 12% of the gross as payment, which is, I've never heard of this. Like I like in every other movie, I hear about 1%, half a percent, something like that, and that's already really good. 12% I've never heard. So they really wanted like the big names in this. Gene Hackman, also a big actor. I think those are the two really big names, and then the rest is kind of not as big, right? Especially 1978. But having your movie opened by Marlon Brando was a big deal. So they were trying to make this legit. But it was at a time where superhero movies were not really a thing, and superheroes were kind of something for children. Like this is already part of the story of Batman 1989, and this is 11 years before this, right? Where nobody, I don't know exactly if had never been a superhero movie. I think there's like my view is that Zorro is a superhero as well because he's a masked crime fighter, right? So the early Zorro movies kind of I would count as the first superhero movies, but in a tights, like capes and tights kind of way, and like just off the comic book page, I think this might be the first, at least in terms of major motion pictures. So they were trying very hard to make this serious and legitimate.
fair enough. Overall, I do see its appeal. I do think it should have its place in history. I don't think you get everything you get afterwards without movies like this, without it making the first steps to try to, like say, legitimize comic book movies, to make it appeal to more than just children at the time, and maybe like families and things like that as well. So yeah, again, it's not the greatest comic book movie, and it doesn't quite enter our Hall of Fame of comic book movies, but it still holds a important place in comic book movie history.
I'm trying to think. Was there anything like created before 1978 that was like superhero?
So there were like there was like a TV serial about Superman in the 50s, I think. So like there had been live action versions of these characters, but no major movies as far as I know.
Okay. Well, I like I said, I do definitely see how it was influential and how some people might say it was the blueprint for more superhero stuff, even though there was stuff created before. But I'd say in terms of like the interest in superhero genre increasing after that. So I do see it. I just think it's hard to kind of like say, oh, I see it because it was a good movie in the times that I'm living in, because obviously for what we've seen, like you've mentioned Man of Steel and stuff, we've seen like for us personally, we've seen way better stuff. So now it's like in terms of like the story, even with the stories, like I've kind of preferred the newest stories rather than this one. However, like I said, obviously, so that's why I'm finding it a bit difficult to kind of give my opinion without lying, because I'm not trying to lie. Like I said, I do appreciate it, and I can see how back in those times it'll be definitely a classic. For me now, if you ask my personal opinion, I wouldn't put it as a classic. However, if I was in 1978, I would say it's a classic. I just think the stuff that you're seeing, like the effects and stuff, is back in those days would locally be out of this world in a way. So yeah, so I'm a bit 50-50. However, I do see why people would say, you'd need to put in the Hall of Fame and why it would be a classic. It's just I can't say that for myself because I'd be lying.
Yeah, I think this movie has some really high highs and some really low lows. I like Clark Kent and Superman. I like Lois. I like the stuff surrounding the Daily Planet. I like the Smallville part of the story, just Superman's background and trying to explain who he is and why he is the way he is. The really big part here is everything to do with Lex, right? His personality, or the slapstick, the scheme, and the way the story ends. Just not a fan. And for that reason, I can't really like the movie as a whole. But if the movie just finished before he gets to Metropolis, I think it would absolutely be the definitive treatment of the origins of that character. And I think it does a really good job of cutting to the core of Superman. And it really wants to realize this character and really wants to kind of just tell the story without any big twist or subversion or changes. It's just, this is the Superman story. This came out in a very different context. And some of the things they really cared about, right? Like making the flying effects work, making the stunts work, making the big spectacle in the end work. All of that, I think, is really impressive by the standards of its time. And I think it really brings its meaning across. And I think even back then, like, I wonder if I was watching it for the first time in 1978, not knowing any of the other superhero movies that have been made since then, and this was just a movie. I don't know if I would like the story, like especially Lex's scheme. I'd like to say no, I would see through how flimsy it is and how lame it is, but I don't know how it really would come across in that context. But looking at it 50 years later, like the Lex stuff just drags it down, and I just cannot enjoy it after that 50% mark. So for me, not one of the greats, but important. Right? This is like, this walked so that other movies could run. And in the meantime, it got a few details really right.
I can agree with that. Guys, we've reached the end of today's discussion. I hope you enjoyed what you've seen.
If you reach this part of the episode, thank you very much for working with us. Of course, we always appreciate your support. If you liked what you heard today and you enjoyed our discussion, you should probably tell a friend. And if you hated everything and you thought we were chatting a bunch of nonsense, you should probably tell an enemy. We are the Eye of the Storm podcast.
All right, guys, you heard it here first, and we will catch you next week. Au revoir.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.